The first season of You follows Joe, a bookstore manager in New York, who becomes obsessed with aspiring writer Guinevere Beck and begins stalking her, manipulating her life to win her over and build a relationship. When Joe meets Beck for the first time, it's a disturbing love at first sight. He fantasizes about being in a relationship with her and justifies all the horrible things he'll eventually do in the name of love as necessary. Joe breaks into Beck's apartment to snoop and learn more about her, and follows her around throughout the day to monitor her. When a drunken Beck falls onto the subway tracks, Joe is miraculously there to save her. He even steals her phone to monitor her conversations after she buys a new one. The first major obstacle in Joe's path to winning. Beck is Benji, her on and off boyfriend. Benji is a real jerk, so Joe feels completely justified in attacking him and locking him in the bookstore basement vault. Eventually, Joe realizes there's no way out of the situation and kills Benji. He covers his tracks by burning the body and making it look like Benji simply disappeared. After Benji's murder, Joe and Beck begin a relationship, but another obstacle appears. Peach, Beck's best friend, who is suspicious of Joe and also obsessed with Beck, manipulating her to fulfill her own desires. Fed up, Joe hits Peach on the head with a rock and leaves her for dead. But unfortunately for him, she survives the attack, unsure of who did it, but still very suspicious. Peach invites Beck to spend time at her family's estate, planning to convince her to move to Paris. Beck declines the offer, realizing Joe was right about Peach's manipulative intentions and leaves. Joe then kills Peach and stages it as a suicide brought on by heartbreak. With Peach out of the way, Joe and Beck are finally free to be together, undistracted. This lasts for a few months until Beck begins acting more distant and reserved, fueling Joe's jealousy and possessiveness. He begins to suspect she's having an affair with her therapist, Dr. Nikki, and even starts seeing the doctor himself under a fake name. Eventually, Joe confronts Beck about the alleged affair with Dr. Nikki. Hurt by Joe's lack of trust, Beck breaks up with him. 3 months go by as Joe tries to move on. Throughout the season, he's also taken care of Paco, the young son of his drug-addicted neighbor, Claudia. Claudia's boyfriend, Ron, is an abusive parole officer who constantly fights with her. Joe starts a relationship with Karen, Claudia's friend, and together they help Claudia get clean. But no matter how hard Joe tries to convince himself that Karen is the right person for him, he just can't get over Beck. Similarly, Beck hasn't gotten over Joe either. So Joe breaks up with Karen and gets back together with Beck, making their relationship seem stronger than ever. But when a resentful Karen tells Beck that Joe is always obsessed with his exes, Beck starts digging into his past, especially his relationship with the mysterious Candace. Beck discovers that Candace was Joe's ex-girlfriend who seemingly vanished from the face of the earth after they broke up, cutting off contact with family and friends for years. Beck suspects something dark behind this, and she should. We learn that Joe killed a man named Elijah after discovering he was having an affair with Candace. Mr. Mooney, the original owner of the bookstore and a father figure who mentally abused Joe as a child, helped him cover up Elijah's death. Although Joe manages to come up with a story to explain Candace's disappearance, all his dark secrets come to light when Beck finds a hidden box in his apartment full of trophies from his previous crimes. Beck's old phone, Peach's phone, Benji's phone, and even Benji's teeth. With his crimes exposed, Joe has no choice but to lock Beck in the bookstore vault while he tries to figure out a way to fix their relationship. Beck begs for her life and her freedom and eventually even suggests Joe pin everything on her therapist, Dr. Nikki. Meanwhile, in Joe's building, Ron assaults Claudia and puts her in the hospital. To protect Paco, Joe is forced to kill Ron and explains to the boy what needs to be done to cover it up. As Joe deals with everything, Beck uses a typewriter in the vault to write her story, detailing all of Joe's horrible crimes, but blaming Dr. Nikki. When Joe finally returns, Beck convinces him that she loves him and understands why he did everything. She lures him into the vault and locks him in, but her escape plan fails when she discovers that the basement door is also locked, and Paco, loyal to Joe, refuses to help her. Joe then escapes the vault and ultimately kills Beck. 4 months later, the manuscript Beck wrote in the vault becomes a huge success. Dr. Nikki is also framed for Joe's crimes. But just when it seems like Joe will get away with everything, his ex-girlfriend Candace shows up very much alive, ready to confront him about their unfinished business. In the second season of You, we discover the truth about Joe's past with his ex, Candace. After a fight upon discovering that Candace was having an affair, Joe accidentally hits her on the head, believing he killed her. He then buries her body and flees. However, Candace wasn't dead. She wakes up after being buried alive. She goes to the police to report Joe, but they don't believe her. So Candace decides to take justice into her own hands, determined to make Joe's life miserable and stop him from hurting another woman. With Candace back in the picture, Joe flees New York and hides in Los Angeles. There, he locks up an identity forger named Will in a newly built vault and assumes his identity. He quickly secures a new apartment and a job in the book section of a trendy market called Anavrin. To prove to himself that he's changed and become a better man, Joe eventually frees the real Will after he promises to keep quiet. But soon, Joe finds a new object of desire. Love Quinn, a recent widow from a wealthy family who owns the place where he works. Unlike Beck, Love throws herself into the relationship from the start. This time, it's Joe who hesitates, afraid that Love will meet the same tragic fate as Beck. However, he eventually gives in to his desires and starts a relationship with her, complicating things even further. Love has a codependent relationship with her twin brother, 40. 40 is a recovering addict who dreams of becoming a famous writer and director but lacks the motivation or talent to succeed. Before long, Joe gets pulled into 40's attempt to write his next film project, an adaptation of Guinevere Beck's book. To make things even more complicated, 40 starts dating a woman named Amy, who is actually Candace, Joe's ex. Candace gets close to Love and tries to warn her about Joe's violent nature. Unfortunately, Love believes Joe's version of the story, painting Candace as nothing more than a bitter, crazy ex. Meanwhile, Joe develops a friendship with his new teenage neighbor, Ellie. When Ellie lands an internship with a famous comedian named Henderson, her older sister Delilah confides in Joe that Henderson has a history of abusing underage girls, including herself when she was younger. Joe switches into Avenger mode and confronts Henderson about his abusive past. The confrontation ends with Joe accidentally pushing Henderson down the stairs, killing him, yet another murder to cover up. Although the police rule Henderson's death as a suicide, Fincher, a friend of Delilah's and a skeptical cop, starts investigating and becomes suspicious of Joe. This prompts Delilah to search Joe's apartment for evidence, and to stop her, he locks her in the vault. Joe doesn't want to kill her and leaves her alive, planning to let her go and flee the country, leaving Love behind. But the next morning, when Joe returns to the vault, he finds Delilah murdered. Candace arrives, locks Joe inside the vault, and calls Love to the scene, hoping to finally prove that Joe is a killer. But the plan backfires. Love kills Candace, and then confesses to Joe that she also killed Delilah to protect her own secret, ensuring that he wouldn't have to run away without her. Then, Love drops an even bigger bombshell. She killed her and 40's nanny when they were kids. And throughout the entire season, she had been manipulating Joe into falling in love with her, just like he once did with Beck. This shatters Joe's idealized vision of Love, and he even considers killing her. But then Love reveals she's pregnant, determined. To be with his child, Joe decides to try to love Love again. While Love forgives Joe's crimes, 40 does not. He confronts Joe and Love, holding Joe at gunpoint. At that moment, Detective Fincher arrives and shoots 40, killing him. Henderson's and Candace's murders end up being pinned on 40, and the Quinn family helps cover everything up. Joe arranges for Ellie to receive money regularly while she goes into hiding to start a new life. Now that all his problems seem to be resolved, Joe is free to be with Love. He moves into a beautiful house in the suburbs where they can raise their child. But discovering that Love is a murderer isn't something Joe can simply forget, and he already has a new object of obsession, his new neighbor. In the third season of You, Joe and Love try to live a peaceful domestic life in the suburbs of Madre Linda, but things quickly begin to unravel. Joe becomes obsessed with their new neighbor, Natalie, and loses interest in both his wife, Love, and their newborn son, Henry. When Love discovers Joe's new obsession, she kills Natalie. After helping Love dispose of the body, Joe and his wife try to cover up Natalie's death while settling into their new community. Joe gets a job with the local librarian, Marianne, helping restore rare books, and she quickly becomes his latest obsession. When Joe finds out that Marianne's ex-husband, Ryan, is using dirty tactics to gain custody of their daughter, he begins stalking him, trying to find a way to help his new love. Eventually, Ryan realizes he's being followed, forcing Joe to kill him. Meanwhile, Love opens her own bakery and builds a new glass cage in the basement. When she discovers that a local resident named Gil caused baby Henry to catch measles, she frames him for Natalie's murder. Love also befriends a local mommy influencer, Sherry Conrad, who suggests that she and her husband Carrie explore an open relationship with Joe and Love. Joe sees this as an opportunity to end his marriage and agrees to the arrangement. As Joe and Love navigate this new dynamic with the Conrads, they accidentally reveal their involvement in Natalie's murder, forcing them to lock Sherry and Carrie in the glass cage. As Love realizes Joe is emotionally pulling away and focusing on his new obsession, she starts a relationship of her own. She quickly becomes romantically involved with Theo, a young college student who later reveals he's the stepson of Matthew, Natalie's widowed husband. Theo tells Love that Matthew suspects Joe is the real killer and has begun illegally surveilling the residence of Madre Linda. Although Matthew eventually gives up the investigation, Theo finds footage of Joe driving Natalie's car and rushes to the bakery to warn Love about her husband's crimes. There, he discovers the Conrads locked in the cage, and Love knocks him unconscious. However, Joe rescues Theo and takes him to the hospital. In the end, Love confronts Joe about his obsession with Marianne, prompting Joe to ask for a divorce. Devastated by her husband's decision, Love drugs Joe and invites Marianne to the house, revealing to the librarian that Joe is violent and responsible for Ryan's death. After Marianne flees, Love tries to kill Joe for his betrayal, but Joe reveals he took an antidote in advance and kills Love instead, framing her for all the murders in Madre Linda. He then sets their house on fire. At the end of the season, Sherry and Carrie escape from the glass cage with their marriage stronger than ever. Matthew and Theo reconcile, and Joe leaves his son Henry in the care of his co-worker Dante before fleeing to Paris, France in search of Marianne. Season 4 begins with Joe living his new life as Professor Jonathan Moore in London, where he hopes to leave the past behind and start fresh under a new identity. However, we find out this wasn't entirely his choice. He fled to Europe after abandoning his son and framing his ex-wife Love for his own murder. All of this was part of a plan to find Marianne and confess his love for her. Joe believed that Marianne would return his feelings, but that wasn't the case. After going to Paris and discovering she was actually in London, he eventually found her and told her the whole truth about Love and what had happened. This immediately drove Marianne away. In the end, Joe decided not to kill her and let her go. Joe made a similar choice when confronted by a hitman hired by Love's family to kill him. Instead of fighting, he struck a deal to earn money for the hitman, but in return, he was supposed to kill Marianne since she knew his true identity. Once again, Joe couldn't go through with it. He realized Marianne saw him as a monster, and he couldn't stand the fear in her eyes. Joe genuinely cared about her, more than anyone he had ever loved before, even more than Beck, Candace, or Love. The identity documents he received were for Jonathan Moore, which led him to stay in London and take a job as a literature professor. The decision to spare Marianne would certainly come back to haunt him, as it was a major focus early in the season and could attract unwanted attention. Over the first 5 episodes, we saw that instead of being the stalker and killer we knew from the previous 3 seasons, Joe was now the victim. He was being stalked by someone mysterious. The first murder was of Professor Malcolm, a member of the elite social circle Joe had recently joined. Joe was manipulated into thinking he had committed the crime himself, but that wasn't the case. Someone else had done it and framed him, knowing he had been drunk that night and remembered nothing. The killer, nicknamed the Eat the Rich Killer, began sending cryptic messages to Joe, hinting that they knew his true identity. As the season progressed, Simon was the next victim, followed by Gemma. In the penultimate episode, it looked like Kate would be next, as the killer strongly hinted at it in their messages. Throughout the season, Joe and Kate grew closer, to the point where she became his new obsession, something he had sworn he would never let happen again. But for her, he was willing to risk everything. Everything changed when Reese, a successful writer, appeared and kidnapped Joe. Reese was the killer and the one behind the messages. He had grown up in a rough environment and despised the wealthy, which is why he targeted and murdered them. He wanted Joe to frame Roald, one of the elite members, for the murders. When Joe refused to kill Roald, Reese set the place on fire, ready to let them both die. However, Joe managed to escape and surprisingly saved Roald, something he never would have done in previous seasons. That moment showed Joe was genuinely trying to change. Another moment that supported this idea came when Joe turned down Kate at the end of the season, knowing that his presence would only hurt her. In the past, he would have ignored her feelings and dived headfirst into the relationship, but this time, he acted differently. What happened with Marianne had truly changed him. In the end, we saw Reese announcing his campaign to become mayor of London, which posed a major threat to Joe, since Reese knew the full truth about his identity, held the upper hand, and could destroy Joe at any moment. As predicted at the end of Part 1, we learned that Reese was, in fact, a real person. However, the version Joe had been talking to was a hallucination, something he had created within his own mind. Obsessed with Reese's book, Joe projected his dark side into the persona of Reese. This mental creation served to justify his murders and the kidnapping of Marianne. We discovered this when Joe met the real Reese and realized he had no idea who Joe was, because in reality, they had never met. This revealed that Joe himself was actually the Eat the Rich killer, committing the murders while in a blackout state. He killed Malcolm because he had insulted Marianne, killed Simon for stealing the work of underprivileged artists and taking credit, and killed Gemma because she was beginning to suspect the deaths that started after Joe's arrival. These blackouts explained why evidence against him would appear out of nowhere, why messages would disappear, and why Reese seemed to have access to Joe's apartment at all times. The truth about Reese also brought another shocking revelation. Marianne had never made it back to Paris, but more on that shortly. From that point on, the hallucinated Reese became the physical manifestation of Joe's dark side throughout the rest of the season. He was the voice in Joe's head, encouraging him to do terrible things, like killing Marianne and Tom. In the final scene, Joe confronts Reese, his evil alter ego, on a bridge before jumping off. He realizes that this dark side had always been trying to protect him by justifying his horrific actions. At the end of the season, even after supposedly burying that side of himself, Joe sees Reese's reflection smiling back at him in a window, proof that his darkness still lives on. But now he no longer has to hide it. With Kate by his side, he has the resources to cover up anything he does. One of the most powerful moments in the episode was Joe's hallucination sequence, in which he revisits all the women he had killed while trying to find the key to free Marianne from the glass box. As Frank Sinatra's Love played, it was almost expected that Love Quinn would appear, and she did. After seeing Gemma, Joe has a vision of Guinevere Beck, who confronts him and reminds him that she never did anything to deserve her death. This was a turning point where Joe begins to accept who he truly is, a bad person. The sequence ends with Love's appearance, helping Joe understand his true nature. For Joe, to love someone means to possess them, to the point that no one else can have them. And that always ends in death. It was the perfect way to bring back the key characters and force Joe to face his own darkness. For the first time, one of Joe's victims had a happy ending. It's revealed that Marianne never actually boarded the train back to Paris. Joe's dark side had already taken over. He drugged her coffee, kidnapped her, and locked her in his infamous glass cage. As soon as Joe and Kate visited the local restaurant, it became clear that his new cage was hidden there. During Joe's interactions with Marianne, we saw his most disturbed and obsessive self. He didn't even recognize his own identity anymore. To him, Joe Goldberg no longer existed. He was only Professor Jonathan Moore. Meanwhile, Nadia had grown suspicious. When she found the key in Joe's apartment, she realized where Marianne was being held. Nadia and Marianne came up with a clever plan. Marianne took medication to slow her heart rate, tricking Joe into thinking she had died. After he disposed of her body, Nadia arrived and used a defibrillator to revive her. Marianne escaped and reunited with her daughter in Paris. Since Joe believes she's dead, he has no reason to go after her, opening the door for a possible return in a future season, perhaps as the one to finally take Joe down. Although the photographer seemed like she'd have a big role in the story, her impact was minimal. She was a stalker obsessed with Phoebe, believing they were best friends. She took Phoebe to a motel and held her there until the police were called. Joe then planted Simon's ear in the photographer's bag, framing her as the Eat the Rich killer and redirecting suspicion away from himself. At the end of the season, Joe kills Kate's controlling father and jumps off the bridge, leading us to believe he's dead. But he survives and wakes up in the hospital with Kate at his side. This scene marks a turning point. For the first time, Joe completely trusts someone and tells her the full truth about his past. Kate promises to stand by him because she loves him. She gives him exactly what he's always wanted: to be seen, heard, and loved. Now, Joe and Kate have returned to New York. He's become a public figure, famous for surviving a deadly marriage. With Kate's power and wealth, Joe can do anything and cover up any crime. He now has complete freedom. Meanwhile, Phoebe moved to Thailand to teach. Sophie moved on with her life. Connie got sober, and Adam was killed by Kate's father. Nadia tried to stop Joe but was framed for a crime she didn't commit and ended up in prison. In the final scene, Joe looks at his reflection and sees Reese smiling back at him, making it clear that his darkness never left. Joe Goldberg is officially back.